It was September of 1985, and the sign at the elevator had new numbers on it. Nobody shouted, nobody argued. The farmers in line read it the way you read a doctor's bill, quietly, already doing the math, already knowing there wasn't much to say. Drying fees up. Storage fees up. Handling fees up. The elevator had debt too, same as everyone else, and debt always rolls downhill. The line moved. Trucks pulled forward. Augers ran. Corn poured in. Life continued. That's the part people miss when they tell stories about the farm crisis. They expect chaos, protests, confrontations, somebody slamming a counter. But most of the dying happened in silence. It happened in lines just like that one. In small percentages. In fees that didn't seem worth arguing about. One of those farmers standing in that line was a man I'll call Earl. He wasn't special. He farmed about 480 acres in central Iowa. Some owned, some rented. Corn and beans. Mostly corn. He'd survived the interest rate spike in '80. Survived 82. Was barely keeping his head above water going into harvest '85. His banker had stopped calling, which either meant things were stable or things were so bad there was nothing left to say. Earl wasn't sure which. He pulled his truck to the scale, read the new fee schedule a second time, pulled out a pencil stub from his shirt pocket, and started doing arithmetic on the back of a fuel receipt. This is where the story really starts. The fee increase wasn't dramatic. That's important to say clearly, because dramatic is what we remember, and this wasn't dramatic. The elevator raised its drying rate by about 4 cents per bushel. Storage went up roughly 2 cents per bushel per month. Handling ticked up a fraction. 4 cents. 2 cents. A fraction. On paper, those numbers look like rounding errors. But Earl was looking at 40,000 bushels of corn. At harvest moisture, call it 21%, that corn needed drying before it could be stored or sold. At the new rate, he was looking at an extra $1,600 in drying costs alone, plus storage if he didn't sell immediately, plus handling. Margin doesn't disappear all at once. That's something I want you to understand before we go any further. Nobody goes broke on a single fee increase. They go broke on the accumulation, 4 cents here, 2 cents there. A bad basis month, a year where you had to sell in October because you had no choice. And October in '85 was the worst possible time to sell corn in Iowa. Earl knew this. He'd been farming since the late '60s. He knew the rhythm of it. What he was starting to understand, standing in that line, pencil on a fuel receipt, was that the rhythm had changed. Here's what the elevator's new fee structure actually meant in practice. When a farmer brings corn to the elevator, he has a few options. He can sell it immediately at the cash price. He can store it and sell later, hoping the price improves, or some combination. The elevator charges for every day the corn sits, and for every BTU of heat it takes to dry that corn down to 15% moisture so it won't spoil. In a normal year, a farmer might store corn from October through January, February, sometimes March, waiting for the post-harvest dip to recover, waiting for export demand to firm up prices, waiting for basis to narrow. But that waiting costs money. Every month of storage was costing Earl roughly $800 at the new rate on his 40,000 bushels. 2 months of storage, $1,600. 3 months, $2,400. On top of drying, on top of handling. And here's the trap. If the price didn't move enough to cover those costs, you'd have been better off selling in October. But you don't know that in October. The elevator wasn't doing anything wrong. They had operating costs. They had debt service on their own facilities. The fee increase was, from their perspective, a rational response to pressure. I want to say that clearly because this story isn't about the elevator being the villain. The elevator was just a business trying to survive the same crisis that was killing its customers. But that doesn't change the math for Earl. He finished his arithmetic. folded the fuel receipt, put it in his chest pocket. He drove home with 68 cents corn and a problem he didn't yet know how to solve. The conversation at the kitchen table that night was quiet. His wife, Donna, was used to those conversations. She'd been keeping the books for 15 years. She already knew the numbers before he sat down. "We can't afford to store at those rates," she said. It wasn't a question. "Not unless price moves 30 cents or more before February," Earl said. "Will it?" He looked at the USDA report on the table. Projected carryout was enormous. Export demand was soft. The dollar was still strong, which was killing competitiveness overseas. There was no obvious catalyst for a 30-cent rally. "Probably not," he said. So they would have to sell, in October, into a market that had 8 billion bushels of corn sitting in it. This is where most farms started bleeding. Not the big dramatic moments. The foreclosures, the auctions, the lawsuits. Those were already downstream. The bleeding started here, in kitchens like Earl's, when the combination of forced selling and high storage costs collapsed the only tool a farmer had: time. Timing is leverage. A farmer with grain and time is a different animal than a farmer with grain and a deadline. The elevator's fee increase hadn't just raised costs. It had shortened Earl's selling window. And a shorter window meant less control. And less control meant the market decided his price, not him. He sat at that table for a long time. Earl sold half his corn in October. He had to. The storage math didn't work, and he needed the cash to cover his fall operating note at the bank. 68 cents a bushel. Not a good price. Not a price he would have chosen if he'd had a choice. The other half he put in the elevator on storage, watching the meter run, hoping. By December, corn had moved to about $0.74. The storage fees had eaten most of that gain. He sold the rest. When he settled up his account, he did the arithmetic again. The drying fees, the storage, the handling, the interest on his operating line. When he subtracted all of it from his gross revenue, his effective net price on that corn was somewhere around $0.62 per bushel. He'd grown corn for $0.62. His cost of production, land rent, seed, fertilizer, chemicals, fuel, machinery depreciation, labor, was somewhere north of 72 cents. That gap, 10 cents a bushel times 40,000 bushels, was $4,000. He'd lost $4,000 on a year's work. Not from bad farming. Not from bad decisions during the growing season. From the structure of how he sold. He looked at that number for a long time. Then he started making phone calls. The first call was to a steel bin manufacturer out of Nebraska. He'd seen their catalog at the co-op. Flat-bottom bins, hopper bins, aeration systems. He wasn't sure what he needed or what he could afford. He just wanted to understand the numbers. What he found out. A 10,000 bushel hopper bottom bin with a simple aeration system and a grain spreader was running about $3,800 to $4,200 installed, depending on site prep and whether you poured your own concrete. Earl's brother-in-law had a cement mixer. Earl had a gravel pad already poured on his farmstead from an old machine shed. $4,000. He'd lost $4,000 last year by not having storage. He could spend $4,000 to have storage. That's not a complicated equation. But nothing about farming in 1985 was simple, because $4,000 was also, for Earl, a significant chunk of the operating line he needed to plant in the spring. Taking $4,000 out of working capital to build a bin meant he'd need to borrow a little more for seed or cut corners somewhere. And his banker was not enthusiastic. "Earl," his loan officer said, "you're already stretched. A bin feels like the wrong direction right now." "A bin lets me sell when I want to sell," Earl said. "It also lets you not sell when you should sell," the banker said. And that was a fair point. I want to stop here for a second, because this is a moment I think about sometimes. The banker wasn't wrong. Grain storage can be a trap, too. Farmers have held grain too long, chased prices that never came, watched corn go out of condition in a bin while the market moved against them. The bin doesn't guarantee anything. It just changes the nature of the risk. What Earl was proposing wasn't a sure thing. It was a bet that having control over his timing was worth more than the cost of the bin, more than the working capital pressure, more than the risk of managing his own grain quality. He believed that. But believing something doesn't make it true. What I find worth thinking about is this: the alternative. Continuing to sell at the elevator's schedule, at the elevator's fees, was also a bet. It was a bet that the current system would treat him fairly. And the evidence of 1985 was that it wouldn't. Not because the elevator was malicious. Just because, when everyone is under pressure, fees go up, and the person with the least leverage pays the most. Earl was paying the most. He'd been paying the most for years. He just hadn't named it until now. He built the bin in March of 1986, before planting. His brother-in-law helped. His neighbor, a man named Dale, came over one Saturday and didn't say much, except to note that a 10,000 bushel bin wasn't going to change Earl's life. 10,000 bushels is about a quarter of your crop, Dale said. You'll still be hauling the rest to the elevator anyway. Yes, Earl said. So what's the point? The point is, I decide when that quarter sells. Dale shook his head the way people shake their heads when they've already decided something is a mistake but don't want to argue about it. He helped bolt the rings together and didn't bring it up again. The community's response was mostly indifference with an undercurrent of skepticism. A few people asked about it. Most were too deep in their own problems to care much about Earl's bin. It was 1986 in Iowa. Half the farms in the county were in some stage of financial distress. A $4,000 grain bin was not the thing people were talking about. Earl finished the bin in early April. He paid for it by selling a small piece of equipment he'd been hanging onto for sentimental reasons, an old 2-row cultivator that hadn't run in 5 years. He got $1,800 for it at a farm auction. He borrowed the remaining $2,200 on a short-term note at the bank to be repaid from fall grain sales. He planted his corn in May. The summer of 1986 was dry. Not devastating, but dry. Corn in central Iowa came in lighter than normal. Call it 140 bushels per acre instead of 155. Earl's gross production was down about 7,000 bushels from the year before. Harvest came. And when he looked at the new fee schedule at the elevator, they'd raised storage rates again, slightly. He felt something different than the year before. He didn't feel trapped. He hauled his first loads to the elevator, the corn that was too wet to bin safely, the fields that yielded poorest. He dried that corn down at the elevator's rates, sold some of it in October to cover his most immediate obligations. The rest, about 8,500 bushels of his best, driest corn, went into his bin. His aeration system ran on a timer. He checked moisture every 2 weeks with a handheld tester. The corn was going in at 14.8%, well within safe storage range. He watched it the way you watch something you've invested in, carefully but without panic. October corn prices were $0.71. Not good, not terrible. He had cash from the elevator corn, enough to make his fall payment and keep the bank quiet. His 8,500 bushels sat in the bin. He waited. November passed. December. Corn moved to $0.76. The storage cost on his own bin was effectively zero. He'd already paid for the bin, and his electricity cost for aeration was maybe $40 a month. Against 0.76 corn, that was less than a penny a bushel per month. Not nothing, but barely visible compared to the elevator's rates. The elevator was charging farmers $0.02 per bushel per month for storage. Earl's cost was a fraction of that. Margin doesn't disappear all at once. In January, something happened in the export market. The dollar had weakened slightly. Not dramatically, but enough. A few large corn sales to overseas buyers moved through, and the futures market responded. December corn was already off the board, but March futures moved up. Earl watched the basis. He wasn't a sophisticated trader. He didn't have a futures account, didn't hedge in the formal sense. But he understood that when futures moved up and the local elevator basis held steady or narrowed, the cash price at the elevator would follow. By mid-January, cash corn at his local elevator was $0.79. He called. Sold 4,000 bushels. Cash in hand within a week. Effective price after his own storage costs, $0.78, against an October price of $0.71. That's 7.5 cents per bushel on 4,000 bushels. $300. That doesn't sound like much, but his bin had cost him $4,000. He was a quarter of the way to recovering the entire cost of the bin in his first season. And he still had 4,500 bushels sitting there. He waited. February was cold and quiet. The bin held. He checked moisture once a week. Steady at 14.6%. The corn was in good shape. Prices drifted. $0.78, $0.77. A little softness. This is where you feel it. The doubt. Because when you've committed to waiting and the market moves against you, even slightly, the brain starts running the calculation. Should have sold in January. Should have sold all of it. I knew this would happen. That's not analysis. That's noise. Earl had made a structural decision, not an emotional one. The bin didn't know what prices were doing. It just held corn. His job was to stay rational and monitor grain quality, the one thing that was actually in his control. He monitored grain quality. In early March, export sales came through again, larger this time. Corn moved to $0.82. He sold the remaining 4,500 bushels. Effective price, $0.815 per bushel, against October's $0.71. Total improvement over forced October selling on his 8,500 binned bushels. Roughly $900 above what he would have netted selling everything in October at elevator storage rates. His bin note at the bank was $2,200. He paid it off. He had $900 of additional margin that he would not have had the year before. Not profit, margin. His operation was still not profitable, but it was less of a loss, and the bin was now paid off. Dale came over in April, when Earl was getting ready to plant again. "How'd the bin do?" he asked. Earl told him the numbers. Dale listened, did the math in his head. "So you netted about $900 more than you would have," Dale said. "On this year's corn, yes. But you could have lost money if prices had dropped instead of going up." "Yes," Earl said. They stood there for a minute. "But the elevator raised their fees again," Earl said. "For next year." Dale was quiet. "Every year I don't have storage. I'm paying their rates on everything. Every year I have storage, I'm choosing when I pay and how much. That's not the same risk." Dale didn't argue. He helped Earl with some early field work that week. On the drive home, Earl thought about the conversation. The bin wasn't a magic solution. It was a structural shift. Small, incremental, financially modest. It had cost $4,000. It had returned $900 in the first season. The payback period was not impressive. But the bin didn't depreciate the way equipment did. It would sit on that pad for 30 years. Every year it sat, it gave Earl something the elevator couldn't give him. A choice about when to sell. Timing is leverage. A farmer without storage has no timing. He has a harvest date and a fee schedule. And the intersection of those two things determines his price. A farmer with storage has a window. Not a guarantee, not a windfall, but a window. And in commodity markets, a window is worth something. The second year, 1987, Earl expanded the system slightly. He put in a simple roof auger extension that let him fill the bin faster from his grain cart. Cost him about $300. He also started keeping a simple log. Date, moisture, local cash price, basis versus nearby futures. So he could see patterns. He wasn't becoming a grain marketing expert. He was just paying attention in a way he hadn't been able to before. By harvest 87, he had the bin full again. 10,200 bushels, thanks to a slightly better year. He sold in tranches, some in November when a short squeeze moved prices briefly, some in February, a small amount in April when he needed the cash for planting. His average effective price for binned corn in '87, about $0.12, better than what he would have received selling everything at harvest at the elevator. On 10,000 bushels, that's $1,200. Against zero storage cost beyond electricity. People don't talk about this part. They want the story to have a dramatic turn. A year where he made $40,000 by waiting. A year where the market doubled and his gamble paid off spectacularly. That's not what happened. What happened was quieter and more durable. Year after year, a modest structural advantage compounded into a material difference. By 1990, he'd added a second bin. By 1992, a third. By 1995, he had enough on-farm storage to hold 60% of his annual production. None of those bins were purchased from profits. They were purchased from the margin that controlled timing made possible. He was not getting rich. He was getting less poor, which in 1985 Iowa was not a small thing. Fees are invisible until they aren't. This is something I want you to sit with for a minute. In every industry, not just farming, there are fees that look small, look reasonable, look like the cost of doing business. And they are, until they accumulate. Until you multiply that 4-cent drying charge by 40,000 bushels, and then by 20 years, and then by the fact that you always had to sell at the worst time because you had no alternative. Earl didn't think about it that way in 1985. He was thinking about the immediate problem. The fuel receipt in his chest pocket. The kitchen table conversation. The $4,000 loss. What he was really calculating, without knowing it, was the cost of structural dependency. Not the elevator's fault. Not a conspiracy. Just the math of what happens when one party controls the infrastructure and another party has to use it. And the first party is under pressure, and pressure always moves downstream. The bin wasn't revenge. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't even particularly remarkable. It was a small, durable structural change that gave one farmer a choice he hadn't had before. By the early 1990s, a few of Earl's neighbors had built bins. Not because of Earl directly. He didn't give speeches, didn't proselytize. But when you're in the same county, farming similar acres, and one man starts averaging better prices year after year through quiet timing choices, people notice. Dale built a bin in 1991. He told Earl he wished he'd done it sooner. Earl didn't say anything dramatic. He nodded, said something about the weather, and went back to work. The elevator, for its part, continued to raise and occasionally lower its fees as its own economics dictated. They weren't punitive about on-farm storage. They couldn't be. Storage competition was good for farmers. It was a fact of the market. The elevator adapted, eventually. Offered some incentives for farmers who would commit to delivering a certain volume. Offered forward contracts with locked basis. The infrastructure of the relationship changed because the power within it had shifted slightly. Not completely. Not permanently. But the farmers who had on-farm storage had leverage they hadn't had before. And leverage changes conversations. It wasn't about the bin. It was about control. I almost made the same mistake Earl almost made. Not the bin, but the thinking before the bin. The thinking that says, this isn't worth the trouble, the risk is too high, things will probably work out. I don't have enough scale to make it matter. That thinking is comfortable. It's also expensive, because the fees don't go away while you're thinking. They keep running. The meter keeps turning. October keeps coming, and October in a bad market is October in a bad market, whether you're ready or not. What Earl understood, eventually, sitting in that line in September of 1985 with a pencil on a fuel receipt, was that readiness is structural, not inspirational. You don't become ready by deciding to be ready. You become ready by building something, paying for something, managing something, over time, before you need it. A $4,000 grain bin is not an answer to a farm crisis. I want to be clear about that. It didn't save Earl. It didn't make him wealthy. It didn't stop the broader tide of consolidation and economic pressure that reshaped Midwest agriculture through the late 80s and 90s. Many of his neighbors lost their farms anyway. What it did was give one man, on 480 acres with a short-term note and a brother-in-law with a cement mixer, a small, durable structural advantage. That advantage over time was worth more than its price. Here's what I want to leave you with. In 1985, a sign went up at an elevator in central Iowa with new numbers on it. Nobody shouted. Nobody argued. The line moved. The corn poured in. Most of those farmers went home, did their math, and figured out how to absorb the new fees. They adapted the way people adapt when they don't have another option. They sold when they had to sell, at the price the market gave them, at the time the infrastructure required. One of them went home, did his math, and decided to change his infrastructure. Not dramatically, not heroically, not with borrowed money he couldn't afford or a gamble he shouldn't have taken. With $4,000, a gravel pad, a brother-in-law, and a Saturday in March. And then he waited. Not for a miracle. Not for the market to save him. Just for a window. A window that the bin made possible and that he had to manage carefully, patiently, without certainty. Most people, when they imagine what surviving a crisis looks like, imagine something dramatic. A moment of clarity. A bold decision. A vindication. It doesn't usually look like that. It usually looks like a farmer in a line, doing arithmetic on a fuel receipt, deciding that 4 cents per bushel multiplied by enough bushels over enough years was worth doing something about. That's what survival looked like in 1985. Quiet. Structural. Earned. If stories like this matter to you, stories about how economics actually works in the ground, in the dirt, in the lines of people who don't make headlines, stay with me. I'm not here to tell you farming is romantic. It isn't. And anyone who says it is hasn't done it in a hard year. I'm here to tell you it's instructive. The farm crisis of the 1980s was one of the most concentrated lessons in agricultural economics in American history. The people who survived it, not all of them, but many of them, survived because they understood structure, because they found some small, durable thing they could control, and they controlled it. Margin doesn't disappear all at once. Timing is leverage. Fees are invisible until they aren't. It wasn't about the bin. It was about control. Those aren't lessons from a textbook. They're lessons from a fuel receipt in a chest pocket, from a kitchen table in October, from a man standing on a gravel pad in March watching his brother-in-law bolt rings together. They're worth knowing.